Look closer at the photograph. January 22nd, 2005. Bethesda-by-the-Sea, the Episcopal Church on the barrier island of Palm Beach, Florida. A 34-year-old Slovenian model in a Dior gown that took months to build, standing beside a 58-year-old developer in white tie, 400 guests behind them, a reception waiting at Mar-a-Lago with a grand Marnier cake that weighed more than the bride. 2 weeks later, that dress was on the cover of Vogue. America filed the image under fairy tale, the Tower and the Beauty, the third marriage of a man who could not stop getting married, and most of the country assumed it would end the way the first two did, loudly in the courts within a decade. It didn't. And the photograph was never a fairy tale to begin with. What the camera recorded that evening in Palm Beach was not the beginning of a romance. It was the closing of a transaction that had been in negotiation for 7 years, executed by a man who had already published in print, under his own name, his operating manual for exactly this moment. Hold that word, closing. We will come back to it at the very end. Here is what this episode will put on the table. First, the chapter Donald Trump, published in 1997, 8 years before this wedding, in which he laid out the prenuptial agreement as a business necessity, told through the story of his first 2 wives. Second, those 2 prior marriages themselves, both of which ended precisely the way their paperwork said they would. One of them settled in 1999 on the explicit terms of a prenuptial agreement. Third, the visa, the EBB. 1, the so-called Einstein visa granted in 2001, and the published reporting that asked whether it was merited, with this caveat stated up front. The reporting raised the question, no document settles it, and an honest teller says so. Fourth, the 5 months in 2017 when the First Lady of the United States did not live in the White House, and the claim a biography published in 2020 made about what was being revisited during that gap, a claim no document has ever confirmed. And fifth, the scholarly frame, what contract theorists actually say about power inside these agreements, and why the long historical record suggests this marriage is not a corruption of the institution, but a return to its original form. One note on method before we begin, because it is the only credential that matters here. Documents and contemporaneous reporting get stated flat. Interested witnesses get named as interested in the same sentence as their claim. Rumor gets labeled as rumor and never carries weight. And where the record cannot settle a question, I will say so out loud, because the questions this episode cannot answer are as instructive as the ones it can. Start where the record starts. Melania Neves was born on April 26, 1970, in Novo Mesto, in what was then Yugoslav Slovenia, and raised in the small industrial town of Sevnica, where her father worked in the car trade and her mother worked in a children's clothing factory. The public record describes her plainly as a Slovenian-American former model. She began modeling at 16, worked in Milan and Paris through the early 1990s, changed the professional spelling of her name, and in 1996 moved to New York. By 1998, she was 28 years old in a profession that retires its workforce young, sharing an apartment, working steadily but not spectacularly. She was not famous. She was disciplined, private, and by every contemporaneous account, deliberate. In September of 1998, during New York Fashion Week, she attended a party at the Kit Kat Club in Times Square. Donald Trump was there. He was 52, 2 years past his separation from his second wife, and he arrived that night with another date. The story of what happened next has been told by both parties, so weigh it accordingly. This is their account, not a transcript. He waited until his date left for the bathroom, approached, and asked for Melania's phone number. She declined. She took his instead. Her stated reasoning, given in later interviews, was that she wanted to see what number he offered, because a man like that has several: the office line, the assistant's line, the private line, and which one he gave her would tell her what she was to him. Stop on that detail, because it is the whole episode in miniature. Before the first phone call, before the first dinner, she was performing due diligence. She has said she then researched who he was before calling him back. The courtship that followed ran, with one reported interruption around 2000 when the couple briefly split, for 7 years. Hold that number. In an industry and a social world where engagements happen in months, this one took 7 years from first meeting to the altar at Bethesda-by-the-Sea, and by the end of this episode, you will see why the length of that runway matters. And there is a date inside those 7 years that almost nobody remembers. In 1999, when Trump was publicly flirting with a Reform Party run for president, reporters interviewed his girlfriend of 1 year about what kind of first lady she would be. She was 29 years old, unmarried, unengaged, and she had an answer ready, a composed, traditional, almost rehearsed answer. File that. 18 years before the East Wing, the role was already part of the conversation, which tells you the scope of what was being contemplated on both sides of this negotiation. Now the paper. To see what sits beneath the wedding photograph, you need 3 documents worth of context, and the first is a definition. Prenuptial agreement, in the standard legal reference definition, is a contract entered into before a marriage that fixes in advance how property will be divided if the marriage ends by divorce or by death. It prices the end of a marriage before the marriage begins. It converts a vow into a term sheet, and courts enforce it not through family sentiment, but through the ordinary remedies of contract law, which is exactly the point the legal scholars make. When a prenup is tested, it is tested as a deal. The second document is a book. In 1997, 1 year before the Kit Kat Club, Donald Trump published The Art of the Comeback, an account of his financial recovery in the 90s and a statement of his business philosophy. Inside it, he devotes an entire chapter to the prenuptial agreement, and he tells it through the story of his first 2 wives. The argument of the chapter is not subtle, and I am not going to dress it up. Marriage, in that telling, is an exposure. The agreement is the hedge. A man of assets who marries without one is, in his stated view, a fool. This was not a private opinion extracted by a hostile reporter. This was a published position, under his own name, on sale in airport bookstores, 1 year before he met the woman in the photograph. Remember the year. 1997. It gets redeemed later. The third document is the track record, because a stated policy only matters if it gets executed, and this one was executed twice before 2005. Execution 1. Ivana. Donald Trump married Ivana Zelnichkova in 1977. The public record describes her not as a decorative spouse, but as an executive of the Trump Organization, a working officer of her husband's company, running major properties through the 1980s. Their marriage had a nuptial agreement from the start, and here is the detail I need you to hold above every other detail. In this episode, contemporaneous coverage of their divorce described an agreement that had been revised repeatedly across the life of the marriage, updated as the fortune grew, the way a company amends a contract when the numbers change. Hold that word, amended. When the marriage collapsed in 1990, In the loudest tabloid divorce of the decade, Ivana challenged the agreement in court, argued the terms did not reflect what the marriage had become, and the fight that followed was, in its essence, commercial litigation. The divorce was finalized in 1992. She had been an executive in the business and a counterparty to the contract, and the second role, not the first, determined how it ended. Execution 2. Marla. Trump married Marla Maples in December of 1993, 2 months after the birth of their daughter. The marriage effectively ended in 1997, the same year. Note the date that The Art of the Comeback and its prenup chapter went to print. The divorce concluded in 1999, and the public record states the outcome in one clean clause. The divorce was settled under the terms of their prenuptial agreement. No trench warfare this time, no headlines for a year. The instrument simply performed. Whatever number was written in 1993 is, functionally, what walked out the door in 1999. That is what a well-drafted contract does. It removes the drama in advance. The second marriage ended not with a scandal, but with an execution of terms. And for a man who measures instruments by whether they perform, the lesson of 1999 was unambiguous. The hedge works. So place the third wedding where it actually sits in this sequence. A man who published his prenup doctrine in 1997, who had amended one such agreement across a 13-year marriage, who had watched a second one settle a divorce cleanly in 1999. That man, in 2005, married for a third time, at 58, with his fortune at stake and his own book on the shelf. And now the honesty caveat, stated at full strength, because this is where a lazier channel would start inventing. No one outside that marriage has ever produced Melania Trump's prenuptial agreement. It has not leaked, it has not surfaced in litigation, it has not been read into any court record. I cannot show it to you. I cannot quote its terms, and anyone who claims they can is selling something. That is precisely why the title of this episode says a contract. Nobody was shown. The record cannot produce the document. What the record can produce is the man's stated policy in his own 1997 book, 2 prior executions of that policy in 1992 and 1999, and a 7-year courtship that gave both parties every opportunity to negotiate. The floor of what is not in dispute is this: nothing in the documented behavior of either party before or after January 22, 2005, is consistent with the absence of such an agreement, and everything is consistent with its presence. I will not draw a fourth point that does not exist. There is one more thing worth saying before we test this frame against the marriage itself, and it cuts in Melania's favor, so listen carefully, because this channel reports the decent complications at full strength. The scholars who study prenuptial agreements most closely, including a body of work examining what its authors call the presumption of free choice, argue that the standard story of the prenup, 2 equal adults freely bargaining, often conceals a sharp imbalance of power, of money, of legal advice, of the sheer ability to walk away. One party has the lawyers and the leverage. The other has a wedding date. Under that lens, signing such an agreement is not cold ambition. For the party without the fortune, it can be the price of admission, presented late, with love as the pressure. If Melania Naus signed a demanding instrument in the winter of 2004-5, the scholarship suggests we should be slow to read that signature as pure calculation and slow to read it as pure free choice. The record cannot settle which it was, and an honest teller should say so. What the record can settle is that she, unlike most brides in that position, had watched 2 previous counterparties go through the machine in public and married anyway, with her eyes open. She was not naive about the paper. Nobody who checked which phone number a man offers before the first date is naive about the paper. So test the frame. If this marriage runs on negotiated terms rather than sentiment, the terms should show through the surface at points of stress. Here are 5 places in the record where, I will argue, the paper shows through the photograph. Judge each on its own rung of evidence because they do not all sit on the same one. Place 1. The runway itself. 7 years, redeemed as promised. From September 1998 to January 2005, through a reported breakup around 2000, through the 1999 First Lady interview, through an engagement in April of 2004, this courtship moved at the pace of a due diligence process, not a romance. Both parties inspected the asset for 7 years before signing. That is documented chronology, flat record, no interpretation needed. Whirlwinds do not take 7 years. Mergers do. Place 2. The visa. In 2001, 4 years before the marriage, Melania Naus obtained permanent residency in the United States through the EB1 category, the classification reserved for individuals of extraordinary ability, known colloquially as the Einstein visa. Published reporting later questioned, in print, whether her modeling career met that extraordinary standard. Be strict about what that is. The reporting raised the question, no document settles it, and an honest teller says so out loud, so treat it as a question, not a verdict, that is its rung. But set the controversy aside and look only at the undisputed timeline, because the timeline is the interesting part. Permanent residency in 2001, marriage in 2005, citizenship in 2006. Her legal standing in this country was secured before the wedding, not through it. In the language of a negotiation, she did not arrive at the table needing the deal to survive. Whatever the marriage was, her green card did not depend on it. That is a stronger bargaining position than almost any account of this marriage bothers to notice, and it complicates the cartoon version of her story from both directions. Place 3. The 5 months. January 20th, 2017, the public record notes it plainly. Melania Trump assumed the role of First Lady at the inauguration, and then she did not move in. From January to June of 2017, the First Lady of the United States lived not in the White House but in Trump Tower in Manhattan, an arrangement without modern precedent. The stated reason given on the record at the time was their son Barron's school year, and that reason is real, documented, and should be reported at full strength, which I have just done. But hold it against the claim that came later. In 2020, a biography of Melania Trump by a veteran Washington reporter claimed, and no document has ever confirmed, that she used exactly this window, those 5 months of physical and symbolic separation, to renegotiate her financial arrangements with her husband, to revisit the terms, with particular attention, in the book's telling, to her son's position. Now place that claim on its rung, out loud. The author is an interested witness with a book to sell. No amended agreement has ever surfaced. No lawyer has confirmed it on the recollection, not a transcript. But notice what the claim asks you to believe, and notice whose pattern it matches. An agreement revisited mid-marriage, updated when the counterparty's circumstances change dramatically, say, when he unexpectedly becomes President of the United States. You were told to hold a word earlier, amended. That is the documented Ivana pattern from the 1980s, the contract revised as the numbers change, applied 1 marriage later. The allegation cannot be verified. Its plausibility is not an accident. She moved into the White House on June 11, 2017, and whatever was or was not signed that spring, the timing sits in the record, 5 months, precisely bounded, and then the move. Place 4, the cameras. May 22, 2017, the tarmac at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. The video is public and 30 seconds long. The president reaches back for the First Lady's hand, and her hand flicks away, once sharp, in front of the traveling press of 2 nations. There were other such moments on camera that spring. Here, the honest teller has to be strict, because this is where coverage of this marriage usually tips into fiction. The camera records the gesture. It does not record the reason, the mood, the argument, or the marriage. A flicked hand is not a deposition, and building a thesis on body language is how bad documentaries get made. So take from place 4 only what it can actually carry, which is this, the public performance of affection. The thing the wedding photograph promised in perpetuity was visibly optional, and in specific documented moments declined. In a romance, that is a mystery. In an arrangement of defined obligations, it is simply a term that was not in the contract that day. Place 5, the role performed to specification, across 2 terms, and the second inauguration came on January 20, 2025. Melania Trump's tenure as First Lady has been executed the way a counterparty executes defined duties: the inauguration, the state occasions, the launched initiative, the convention appearances, delivered and between them, absence, unexplained and unapologized for, reported extensively across 2025 as a First Lady who spends much of her time away from Washington. Interpretations of that absence are opinion, and I will leave them on the opinion rung. The pattern itself is schedule, and schedule is record. She appears where appearance is, so to speak, contractually load-bearing, and almost nowhere else. Compare her, for one sentence, to the woman in the 1999 interview who named the traditional First Ladies as her models. She told us the scope of the role she was prepared to perform 18 years early, and then she performed almost exactly that scope, and no more. The 1997 book told us his terms. The 1999 interview, in a real sense, told us hers. Which brings us to the deepest reading, and it is the one I actually want you to leave with, because it inverts the premise of every scandalized headline ever written about this couple. The scholarly literature on marriage and property is blunt about something our culture works hard to forget. For most of recorded history, across most of the world, marriage was a property instrument. It moved land, consolidated fortunes, secured heirs, and merged families as deliberately as any commercial combination, and the people inside those marriages knew it. The love match, the marriage founded on sentiment alone, unaccompanied by paper, is a recent and largely middle-class invention, a 2-century anomaly that we have retroactively declared to be the institution's true form. And the contract scholars complete the thought from the other side, when they note that even modern marriage without a prenup is still a contract, its terms simply written by the state instead of the spouses, enforced by the same courts, dissolved by the same remedies. Every marriage runs on a contract. Most couples just never read theirs. Under that light, look at what this episode has actually documented. A man who wrote his terms down in 1997 and published them. A woman who verified the counterparty before the first phone call, secured her own legal standing by 2001, negotiated for 7 years, and has performed her defined role to specification for 2 decades. 2 prior agreements, one amended and litigated by 1992, one executed cleanly in 1999. A reported renegotiation in 2017 that no document confirms and every documented pattern predicts. This is not a perversion of marriage. This is marriage as the historical record has known it for 1,000 years, stripped of the modern paint. The scandal is not that this couple has a contract. The scandal is that theirs is explicit, and we have agreed to find that vulgar while pretending our own arrangements are made of nothing but feeling. So I'll go back to Palm Beach. January 22nd, 2005. Look at the photograph again, and this time read it item by item, the way you would read an exhibit. The Dior gown, which within 2 weeks was on the cover of Vogue, the wedding itself functioning as a media asset before the cake was cut. The groom, 8 years after publishing the chapter that priced this exact moment, standing in the church with 2 executed agreements already behind him, 1992 and 1999, filed and performed. The bride, 34 years old, 7 years into the negotiation, 4 years into her own permanent residency, 1 year from citizenship, 13 months from the birth of their son in March of 2006, 12 years from the East Wing, her eyes open, her research done since the night she declined to give out her number. America looked at that image and saw a fairy tale and confidently predicted its collapse. 20 years later, the marriage that was never a romance has outlasted both of the marriages that claimed to be. Of course it has. Romances end. Contracts perform. The photograph you were shown was never the fairy tale. It was the signature page, and the parties have been in performance ever since. She was not swept away in Palm Beach that evening. She closed. If this kind of forensic history is what you came for, subscribe and consider the like button. It genuinely helps these files reach the people who read the fine print. I'll see you at the next photograph.